You're watching the blade descend through candlelight, its edge so sharp it catches the flicker like liquid silver. The child doesn't scream. They've been given wine mixed with poppy extract, enough to dull, but not enough to erase. In the corner, a priest murmurs prayers while a physician prepares hot irons for cauterization. The smell of burning flesh will fill this room in moments. 3 out of 4 children who enter this chamber will never leave it alive. This isn't a dungeon. This is a licensed medical facility in Constantinople, operating under imperial charter, and there's a waiting list of parents outside. The year is 537 AD, and you've just witnessed what the Byzantine Empire called economic opportunity. Before we go deeper, I'm genuinely curious where you're watching this from. It still amazes me that a story buried in thousand-year-old legal codes can reach someone halfway across the world today. Drop a comment with your location. Now, let me show you what history textbooks won't. The Byzantine Empire stood for 1,123 years, longer than any empire in European history. From 330 to 1453 AD, it preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology. Its library saved classical texts that would spark the Renaissance. Its architects built Hagia Sophia, a dome so massive that medieval visitors believed it hung from heaven by golden chains. Scholars traveled thousands of miles to study in its universities. We remember Byzantium as the empire that held back invasions, translated Aristotle, and kept Western civilization's flame burning through the Dark Ages. But empires don't survive for 11 centuries through wisdom alone. Beneath those golden mosaics and philosophical treatises ran a machinery of sexual violence so systematic, so thoroughly documented, that the Byzantines themselves kept detailed records, not to condemn it, but to standardize it. They wrote medical manuals describing the optimal age for castration. They drafted legislation specifying exactly how to mutilate adulterers. They maintained pricing ledgers showing that a castrated 10-year-old boy was worth 3 times more than an intact child. This wasn't barbarism. It was policy. And the most disturbing part? They justified every bit of it through Christianity. The same faith that preached mercy and love transformed into an instrument of control, so refined that victims were expected to thank God for their suffering. Let's start with the foundation of it all: how Byzantium weaponized shame itself. By the 6th century, Christian doctrine in the Eastern Roman Empire had evolved into something its early followers wouldn't recognize. Sexual desire, even between married couples, became evidence of demonic possession. The theological logic was elegant and terrifying. Adam and Eve fell through carnal knowledge, therefore all sexuality carried original sin's stain. Pleasure wasn't just immoral, it was proof you'd surrendered to Satan. But theology alone doesn't control populations. For that, you need law. The Ecloga of 726 AD represents one of history's most deceptive legal innovations. Emperor Leo III announced it as Christian mercy. He was eliminating the death penalty for dozens of crimes. Imagine the public celebration, an emperor choosing compassion over execution. Church officials praised his humanitarian spirit. Then people read the actual penalties. Instead of execution, the Ecloga prescribed mutilation calibrated to erase your humanity while keeping you alive as a warning. If you committed adultery, imperial surgeons cut off your nose, not in a quick slice but carefully, leaving enough scarred tissue that you'd spend the rest of your life with a face advertising your shame. You couldn't hide it. You couldn't heal it. Every person you met would know what you'd done before you spoke a word. For women, the punishment went further. After rhinotomy, that's the technical term for nose removal, they were confined in convents, where abbesses often subjected them to additional spiritual correction that left no physical marks but broke something deeper. And if you were caught in homosexual acts. The law stated you should be emasculated, a clinical term for genital destruction designed to be both permanent and agonizing. But here's where it gets psychologically sophisticated. The ecloga called this mercy. The official theological justification was that mutilation gave criminals time for penance. Death meant immediate judgment before God, but if you lived without your nose, your genitals, or your eyes, another favorite Byzantine punishment, you had years to repent and potentially earn salvation. You were supposed to be grateful. Think about that logic for a moment. The empire created a system where victims of state violence were spiritually obligated to thank their torturers for the opportunity to suffer their way into heaven. It's psychological torture masquerading as salvation. And it was everywhere. Provincial governors kept standardized cutting tools. Bishops supervised the punishment proceedings to ensure theological correctness. Medical texts described optimal amputation techniques to prevent death from bleeding, because dead victims couldn't serve as walking advertisements for imperial control. But adult punishment was only one pillar of the system. The foundation was built on something far more disturbing: the industrialization of child exploitation. In 329 AD, Constantine the Great issued a decree that still echoes through history's darkest corridors. Parents could legally sell their newborn children if they claimed poverty. Think about what that law creates. Overnight, children became commodities. Babies became currency. The empire wasn't stupid. Officials knew exactly what would happen. They knew that poverty-stricken families across Byzantine territories would face an impossible calculus. Watch all your children starve, or sell one to save the others. And they knew who'd be buying. By the 5th century, Constantinople had developed a sophisticated child trafficking network that operated in plain sight. Brothel mistresses, called pornoboskis in official documents, traveled to rural provinces like merchants visiting trade fairs. They'd arrive at villages where crop failures had made families desperate, set up in local inns, and wait. A mother would arrive first, usually. She'd be maybe 16 herself, holding a daughter of 7 or 8. The pornoboskis would examine the child with the same clinical detachment used for evaluating livestock, checking teeth, looking for scars or deformities, assessing whether the girl's frame suggested she'd developed the physical characteristics male clients preferred. Then came negotiation. The average price was 10 gold numismata, roughly equivalent to a skilled laborer's annual wages. For families facing starvation, it was an impossible sum. The mother would cry. The pornoboskis would be unmoved. She'd explain, almost kindly, that the girl would have food, shelter, training in music, and conversation. She'd never mention what that training actually entailed. Imperial legislation from 428 AD openly acknowledged that poverty drove these transactions. A law from 529 AD under Justinian attempted to curb the practice by penalizing everyone involved: parents, pimps, and brothel owners. But here's the revealing detail. The penalties varied based on social class. Wealthy pornoboskis faced fines. Poor ones faced the mines, brutal labor camps where most workers died within a year. Rich fathers who sold daughters received admonishment and loss of parental rights. Poor fathers got the mines too. The law wasn't designed to protect children. It was designed to protect the system's appearance while ensuring that elite participants could continue operating with minimal consequence. And the empire had created a perverse economic incentive that made child abuse not just possible, but profitable. Castrated children were worth triple the price of intact ones. The logic was coldly practical. Eunuchs could serve in imperial households without the danger of sexual affairs with royal women. They could achieve high governmental positions precisely because they couldn't found rival dynasties. And in the twisted marketplace of Byzantine sexual exploitation, castrated children fetched premium prices from specific clientele. So the empire built what were essentially castration factories. Paulus of Aegina, a 7th century Byzantine physician, wrote medical manuals that described 2 castration methods with cookbook precision. The first involved crushing the testicles of prepubescent boys in a vice-like device until they atrophied. Excruciating, but theoretically safer than cutting. The second method was surgical removal with immediate cauterization using hot irons. The mortality rate tells you everything you need to know about Byzantine priorities. Statistics preserved in Coptic monastery records indicate that 75% of boys subjected to castration died from the procedure, usually from infection, hemorrhage, or shock. 3 out of 4 children murdered for economic convenience. But the 25% who survived became valuable commodities. Noble families castrated their own younger sons as career strategy. When you couldn't inherit your father's title, Byzantine inheritance favored the eldest son. Castration became a pathway to different power. The empire's bureaucracy had positions specifically reserved for eunuchs, palace chamberlains, treasury officials, even military commanders of certain divisions. 2 sons of Emperor Romanos, Secrecy, were castrated by their own father. Theophylact became Patriarch of Constantinople, the second most powerful religious position in the Eastern Christian world. His brother Basil became the de facto ruler of the entire empire for 40 years. Their father had made them powerful by destroying them first. Imagine the calculation. You're a Byzantine nobleman with 3 sons. The eldest inherits everything. The second and third face lives of diminished status, unless you castrate them young, in which case they might achieve positions even your eldest couldn't reach. So you do it. You hand your 7-year-old son to a physician, hold him down if necessary, and gamble his life on a 25% survival rate. And if he dies screaming on that table, well, God's will. The empire had normalized child mutilation so thoroughly that parents volunteered their own children, physicians developed specialized expertise, and the church provided theological justification for the entire apparatus. But the church's relationship with sexuality went even further into contradiction. Monasteries, supposedly refugees of spiritual purity, routinely expelled eunuchs. The same institutions that preached acceptance and charity systematically rejected the victims of imperial mutilation. The theological logic was Byzantine in its complexity. Eunuchs were considered spiritually contaminated by the violent act that had unmanned them, even if they'd been children when it happened. So castrated boys grew into men who belonged nowhere. Too sexually ambiguous for monasteries, too marked by shame for normal society, they existed in a permanent liminal space where everyone used them but no one claimed them. Except the imperial court, which found their absolute vulnerability incredibly useful. And then there's Theodora. Before she became Empress of the Byzantine Empire and co-ruler with Justinian the Merc, before she influenced legal reforms and championed women's rights, before she was depicted in shimmering mosaics that still draw tourists to Ravenna, she was a child prostitute in Constantinople's entertainment district. Let's be precise about what that means. Procopius of Caesarea, official court historian, wrote 2 accounts of Justinian's reign. One was the glowing public version. The other, called The Secret History, remained hidden for centuries because of what it contained. In it, Procopius describes Theodora's early life with detail so specific that scholars believe he witnessed or heard direct accounts of her performances. According to his secret manuscript, Theodora worked in a Constantinople brothel before puberty. She couldn't yet perform complete services, so she was used in ways that didn't require sexual maturity, acts that modern law would classify as severe child sexual abuse. Think about what that means institutionally. The brothel had a business model that included prepubescent children. It maintained a pricing structure for different age categories. It employed staff who specialized in different services based on the children's physical development. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't happening in shadows. It was a business operating in the empire's capital city. When Theodora reached puberty and transitioned to stage performance, she couldn't play musical instruments or dance with the skill required for respectable theater. So she became what the Byzantines called a porneia, a performer whose act was explicitly sexual. Her signature performance, described in meticulous detail by Procopius, involved stripping naked on stage, lying on her back and having slaves pour grain across her genitals and breasts. Then trained geese would waddle across her body, pecking at the grain, while audiences watched this mixture of bestiality and degradation as entertainment. The wealthy and powerful of Constantinople paid premium prices to watch this. The same aristocrats who attended church services praising sexual purity, who supported laws mutilating adulterers, who donated to monasteries preaching abstinence. They filled theaters to watch a woman be sexually violated by animals as a theatrical performance. Another popular act cast Theodora as Leda from Greek mythology, the mortal woman raped by Zeus disguised as a swan. On stage, she would recline nude while a swan, actually a man in minimal costume, simulated the mythological rape. The audience understood the symbolism. They knew what they were watching. They applauded. Then Justinian, heir to the imperial throne, fell in love with her. Or perhaps he didn't fall in love so much as become obsessed. Or maybe, and this might be the most disturbing possibility, he appreciated her precisely because her degradation had prepared her for the performative nature of Byzantine power. They married in 525 AD, shortly before Justinian became emperor, and Theodora, the child prostitute, the stage performer who'd been sexually exploited by both humans and animals for public entertainment, became Augusta, the empress of Rome's successor state. Her rise wasn't a redemption story. It was a revelation about how Byzantine power actually worked. The same system that destroyed her as a child elevated her as an adult, not despite her abuse, but because she'd survived it in ways that demonstrated the exact ruthlessness the empire required. As empress, Theodora pushed for laws protecting women from forced prostitution. She established a convent that rehabilitated former sex workers. She used her power to rescue hundreds, possibly thousands, of women from the system that had consumed her childhood. Historians still debate her moral paradox. She reformed abuses, yet upheld the same Byzantine system that created them. That machinery of control permeated intimacy itself. Marriage wasn't love, it was law. The wedding night became proof of legality, with witnesses nearby to confirm consummation. Without verification, marriages could be annulled and dowries reclaimed. Bloodied sheets served as legal evidence, preserved for future disputes over property or legitimacy. Imagine the psychological toll. Your first night judged, your body's responses recorded for the state. Even a missing stain could destroy reputations, turning private lives into public trials of purity and obedience. The law had exact penalties for these failures. The Ecloga specified compensation rates for non-consummation based on a complex formula involving the bride's dowry, the groom's social status, and whether the failure was deemed physical or intentional. Your sexual adequacy became a matter of contractual compliance. Byzantine marriage contracts included provisions for sexual performance that read like warranty agreements. The groom guaranteed functionality. The bride guaranteed virginity. Families negotiated terms like merchants arranging a trade deal for pottery or textiles. But at least in these marriages, there was legal framework, however dehumanizing, for enslaved people, for conquered populations. For anyone outside the narrow circle of citizen privilege, there was no framework at all, only systematic vulnerability. When Byzantine armies conquered territory, the sexual violence that followed wasn't undisciplined chaos. It was strategy. Military manuals from the period described the deliberate use of rape as psychological warfare. The goal wasn't simple brutality. It was the calculated destruction of community leadership through sexual humiliation. Captured leaders faced public assault designed to transfer their masculine authority to their conquerors. The logic was both theological and political. Byzantine military theorists believed that forcing a man into a sexually passive role literally stole his power. It wasn't symbolic. They thought it was metaphysically real, that dominance could be transferred through sexual violation. Conquered rulers who survived this treatment couldn't return to their communities with authority intact. Their own people often rejected them because Byzantine culture had successfully exported its own sexual shame to surrounding territories. The victim became permanently marked, wandering in exile, a living advertisement for Byzantine dominance. Because Byzantium documented everything, we have chilling records, account books listing captives by name, age, and the abuses they suffered. Military reports described these acts with bureaucratic precision, as if cataloging weapons. The empire had turned sexual violence into statecraft. For centuries, children were sold, mutilated, and exploited as policy. Even marriage became a regulated transaction, sanctified by blood. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the empire died, but its codes endured. Legal texts, medical manuals, and theological writings survived in monasteries and universities, shaping ideas of power, morality, and the state's control over human desire for generations. They survived long enough to influence later empires, later churches, later systems of control that found inspiration in Byzantium's ruthless efficiency. There's a mosaic in Ravenna showing Theodora in imperial purple, surrounded by attendants, her face serene with absolute authority. She's holding a golden chalice, probably bringing an offering to church. The artists captured every detail: the jewels in her crown, the embroidered flowers on her robes, the way light seems to emanate from the gold background. But they couldn't capture what she carried beneath that serenity. The child prostitute survived. The performer who endured public degradation survived. The woman who learned that power and vulnerability weren't opposites but twisted together in ways most people never comprehend. She survived. And she used that survival to rule an empire that had tried to destroy her. History remembers Byzantium's mosaics, its literature, its theology. But beneath the gold leaf ran 1,000 years of systematic sexual violence so thoroughly documented that we can reconstruct it in excruciating detail. The victims weren't abstractions. They were children sold by desperate parents, boys who gambled their lives on castration tables for a chance at power, women whose wedding nights became legal proceedings, conquered peoples whose bodies became instruments of imperial messaging. They don't have mosaics. They don't have monuments. Most don't even have names. But they were there, beneath every gleaming surface, holding up the empire that crushed them. And the most terrifying part? The Byzantines thought they were building the kingdom of heaven on earth.